Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update. I am your host, Richard D. Wolff. Today, I want to take you on a journey into a story that is currently unfolding in the headlines, but is being fundamentally misunderstood by the mainstream press. You see, when the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal reports on a trade war, they treat it like a sporting event. Who scored a point? Who blinked? Who has the leverage? They look at the surface. But we have to look deeper. We have to look at the structural reality of the capitalist system that produces these conflicts in the first place. And the story I want to discuss today involves the United States and its neighbor to the north, Canada. It is a story about aluminum, about electricity, about the so-called green economy, and most importantly, it is a story about the profound, unfixable contradictions of global capitalism in the 21st century. Let us start with the facts as they are being reported, and then we will peel back the layers to see what is really going on. The United States, in its infinite wisdom, or perhaps we should say, in the infinite chaos of its declining imperial power, decided to escalate a trade conflict with Canada. The U.S. government, driven by a desire to look tough on trade, to appeal to a certain nationalist sentiment, imposed steep tariffs on aluminum imports. Now, on the surface, this looks like standard protectionism. The United States wants to protect its domestic producers, but here is where the dialectic kicks in. Here is where the contradiction explodes in their faces. It turns out that the United States does not have the capacity to produce the aluminum it needs. It simply does not exist. And more importantly, it does not have the capacity to produce the kind of aluminum that modern global capitalism demands. We are talking about something called green aluminum. Now, please do not be fooled by the marketing term. In the language of economics, this refers to aluminum produced using hydroelectric power rather than coal. Aluminum smelting is basically solidified electricity. It requires massive amounts of energy. Canada, specifically Quebec, spent decades publicly, I might add, often through state-directed utility planning, building a massive hydroelectric infrastructure. They have abundant, cheap, clean energy. The United States? The United States spent those same decades allowing its infrastructure to rot, allowing private profit to dictate energy policy, and failing to invest in the long-term industrial base because it was cheaper in the short run to outsource everything or rely on dirty coal. So now, fast forward to today. You have massive American corporations, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, the giants of the food and beverage industry. These are the titans of American capitalism. They have made a calculation. They have told their shareholders, we are going to be sustainable. We are going to meet ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards. Why do they do this? Is it because they have suddenly developed a moral conscience? Is it because the CEO of Coca-Cola wakes up at night worrying about the polar bears? No. They do it because the market demands it. They do it because their investors demand it. They do it because if they don't, their brand value collapses. They need that green stamp on their cans to keep selling sugar water to the world. And here is the trap. Here is the beautiful, terrible irony. To get that green stamp, they need Canadian aluminum. They cannot use Chinese aluminum because China, operating under its own capitalist industrial logic, powers its smelters with coal. That aluminum is dirty. It fails the carbon certification. The Europeans don't have enough to sell. The Americans don't produce it. Canada is the only game in town. Canada produces 3.3 million tons, and 90% of it is that hydro-powered green metal. The United States imports 70% of its aluminum from Canada. It is a dependency so deep, so structural that no amount of political rhetoric can wish it away. So, when the U.S. government slaps a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum, thinking they are punishing Canada, what are they actually doing? They are punishing Coca-Cola. They are punishing Pepsi. They are punishing the very American corporations they claim to represent. The Canadian producers didn't panic. Why would they? They sat back. They adjusted their pricing. They let the market absorb the signal. And the signal is this: you need us. We don't need you. The Canadians know that the U.S. cannot replace this supply chain. You cannot build a hydroelectric dam and a smelting infrastructure in 6 months. It takes decades. It takes the kind of long-term planning that American capitalism, with its obsession with quarterly profits, has completely abandoned. This is a classic example of what Marx called the anarchy of production. In a rational system, you would look at North America as a whole. You would say, okay, Quebec has the hydropower. Let's produce the aluminum there for the benefit of everyone. But we don't live in a rational system. We live in a system of competing nation states and competing capitals. The U.S. state apparatus wants to show strength with tariffs. The U.S. corporate sector wants cheap green inputs to maintain their profit margins. These two forces are colliding. The state is hurting the capital it is supposed to serve. And who pays the price? You do, the worker, the consumer. Because when Coca-Cola's costs go up because of a trade war started by politicians who don't understand supply chains, do you think Coca-Cola absorbs that loss? Of course not. They pass it on to you in the price of the can, or they squeeze their workers harder to make up the difference. Let's dig a little deeper into the history here, because history is where the secrets are buried. Why does Canada have this advantage? It is not an accident. It is the result of a different approach to development. In Quebec, the energy sector was nationalized. Hydro-Quebec is a state-owned enterprise. It was built with public money for the public good to develop the industrial base of the province. It was not left entirely to the whims of the private market, because if you had left it to the private market in the 1960s or 70s, private investors might have said, well, coal is cheaper right now, let's just burn coal. But the state planned, and because they planned, they now have a strategic asset that is worth billions in the 21st century. Contrast that with the United States. In the U.S., the ideology of neoliberalism, the idea that the government should get out of the way and let the invisible hand run everything, has decimated our industrial capacity. We didn't upgrade our smelters. We didn't build the green energy grid needed to support heavy industry. We chased the cheapest labor and the laxest environmental regulations around the world. We deindustrialized. And now, when geopolitics shifts, when the world starts demanding low-carbon products, the United States finds itself naked. It finds itself unable to produce the basic materials of a modern economy. This is not just a policy failure, it is a systemic failure. It is the failure of a system that prioritizes short-term financial extraction over long-term physical production. And look at the panic inside the boardrooms. The report tells us that financial teams at these major brands are running the numbers, and the math is ugly. I bet it is. They are realizing that their entire business model, selling billions of aluminum cans, rests on a fragile assumption that they could always get cheap, clean metal from their friendly neighbor to the north. They took it for granted. This is the arrogance of the American empire, the assumption that the resources of the world, and especially the resources of the Americas, are just there for the taking, that Canada is just a branch plant, a resource colony for the U.S. Well, the colony has leverage now. The colony holds the keys to the green future that American corporations are desperate to inhabit. Think about the absurdity of this trade war. The U.S. claims it is about national security. That is usually the excuse for these tariffs. We need to protect our aluminum industry for national security. But if your domestic industry is obsolete, if it runs on coal, if it cannot meet the standards of the modern world, protecting it doesn't make you secure. It makes you isolated. It locks you into the past. By taxing the green aluminum from Canada, the U.S. is effectively trying to tax the future to subsidize the past. They are trying to build a wall around a dinosaur. And the result is that American companies are going to bleed cash. American consumers are going to pay higher prices, and the transition to a sustainable economy is going to be slowed down, all to serve a political theater that has no basis in economic reality. This situation also reveals the lie of free trade. For years, we were told that free trade would solve everything, that borders didn't matter, that capital would flow to where it was most efficient. Well, under NAFTA and now the USMCA, the economies of Canada and the US were integrated. They were welded together. But the moment political tensions rise, the moment one side thinks it can gain a tactical advantage, the free trade agreements are thrown out the window. Tariffs are weapons. They are acts of economic warfare. And in this war, the United States has miscalculated. They brought a knife to a gunfight. They thought they could bully Canada into submission, not realizing that Canada controls the oxygen supply for the American beverage industry. This is what happens when you have a system based on competition rather than cooperation. Imagine a different world. Imagine a socialist world. In a socialist North America, we would look at the hydro resources of Quebec and say, this is a social asset. Let us use this to produce the cleanest aluminum possible for all the people of the continent. We wouldn't have tariffs. We wouldn't have trade wars. We wouldn't have Coca-Cola worrying about its stock price. We would plan production to meet human needs, the need for beverages, the need for construction materials, the need for a livable climate. But we don't have that. We have capitalism. And so we have this absurd spectacle of two wealthy nations fighting over metal prices while the planet burns and the workers in both countries struggle to pay their bills. And let's not forget the workers. What happens to the workers in the U.S. aluminum sector, the few that remain? They are told that these tariffs are for them. We are protecting your jobs, the politicians shout. But are they? If the downstream industries, the bottling plants, the construction firms, the car manufacturers, if they have to pay 50% more for their raw materials, what do? They cut costs elsewhere. They lay off workers. They automate. They move factories to countries where the aluminum isn't taxed. So a tariff to save 500 jobs in a smelter might cost 5,000 jobs in a canning plant. This is the interconnectedness of the capitalist economy that the crude protectionists never understand. You cannot isolate one part of the body and treat it while ignoring the rest. The strategic precision of Canada's response is also worth noting. They didn't just lash out. They waited. They let the price mechanism do the work. This is a lesson in power. Real power in the 21st century isn't just about aircraft carriers. It's about supply chains. It's about critical minerals. It's about energy infrastructure. Canada has quietly built a fortress of green energy. The United States has spent its money on wars and tax cuts for the rich. Now the bill is coming due. The U.S. is finding out that you cannot eat aircraft carriers. You cannot build a green economy with tax cuts. You need physical stuff. You need infrastructure. And if you haven't built it, you are at the mercy of those who have. I want you to think about the boardroom at PepsiCo right now. These are people who are paid millions of dollars to manage risk. And yet they miss this. Why? Because they operate on the logic of the quarter. They look at the next 3 months. They don't look at the next 30 years. They assume the political stability of the US-Canada relationship was eternal. They assumed the neoliberal order would hold, but the neoliberal order is fracturing. The world is breaking up into competing blocks. And in this new world, if you don't control your own resources, if you don't control your own energy, you are vulnerable. The giants of American capitalism are discovering that they are giants with clay feet, and the clay is cracking. This aluminum story is a microcosm of the larger crisis. It is a crisis of a system that has reached its limits, a system that can no longer reconcile the drive for profit with the physical realities of the planet or the political realities of the nation state. The US wants to be the hegemon, but it can't afford the infrastructure. It wants to be green, but it clings to coal and oil. It wants to dominate trade, but it depends on imports for its survival. These are contradictions that cannot be solved within the existing framework. They can only be managed, and badly. And every time they try to fix it with a tariff or a trade war, they only make the contradictions sharper. They only expose the rot deeper. As we move forward in this analysis, we are going to look at what this means for the future. What happens when this trade war escalates? What happens when other commodities are drawn in? Because make no mistake, this is not just about aluminum cans. This is about everything. It's about steel. It's about lumber. It's about the rare earth minerals needed for computers and batteries. The United States is discovering that it is not an island. It is part of a global web, and it has spent decades cutting the very strands that hold it up. Now it is dangling over the abyss, and the people holding the rope, in this case the Canadians, are starting to wonder why they should keep pulling. This is part one of our deep dive into the political economy of the trade war. We have set the stage. We have identified the players. We have exposed the central contradiction, a declining imperial power lashing out against a strategic resource dependency it created through its own negligence. In the next segment, we will explore the labor dimension of this. We will look at how the unions in both countries are positioned and how the working class is being used as a pawn in this game of billionaires. We will also look at the environmental hypocrisy of green capitalism and why a tariff war over green aluminum ultimately does nothing to solve the climate crisis. But for now, remember this. When you see a headline about tariffs, don't just see taxes. See the cracking foundations of a system that has prioritized profit over people and speculation over production for far too long. Welcome back to this special report on the unfolding economic conflict between the United States and Canada. In the first part of our analysis, we expose the structural contradictions of a trade war fought over green aluminum, a resource the United States desperately needs but cannot produce, and which Canada controls through decades of state planning. But now we must turn our attention to the human cost. We must look at the class dynamics that are always at the heart of these geopolitical squabbles. We have to ask the question that the mainstream economists refuse to ask: who pays and who profits? Let us look at the labor movement. Historically, and this is a painful truth for those of us on the left to admit, some segments of the American labor leadership, particularly in the steel and aluminum sectors, have lined up behind these tariffs. They have bought into the narrative of protectionism. They have been told by politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, that if we just tax the foreigners enough, the jobs will come back. Make America great again, or build back better. The slogan changes, but the logic remains the same. It is the logic of nationalism used to obscure the reality of class exploitation. But let's look at the reality. When the US government imposes a tariff on Canadian aluminum, does that money go into the pocket of the aluminum worker in Kentucky or New York? No, it goes into the general treasury of the United States government, which then spends it on the military industrial complex or tax subsidies for the very corporations that are outsourcing jobs. The tariff is a tax on the supply chain, and when costs rise for Ford, for Boeing, for PepsiCo, their first move is never to cut executive bonuses. Their first move is to squeeze labor. They will say, oh, our raw material costs are up, so we cannot afford to give you that raise. In fact, we might have to lay off a shift. The worker is told the tariff protects him, but in reality, the tariff becomes the excuse to oppress him further. This pits the American worker against the Canadian worker. The Canadian aluminum workers, who are often highly unionized and work in facilities powered by public utilities, are painted as the enemy. They are stealing our jobs. This is the oldest trick in the capitalist playbook: divide and conquer. If the American worker is angry at the Canadian worker, he is not looking at his own boss. He is not looking at the private equity firm that stripped his factory of its assets. He is not looking at the system that failed to invest in modern technology. He is looking across the border at another worker who is just trying to feed their family. This is how the system survives, by turning the victims against one another. And then there is the hypocrisy of the green label. We must be very careful here. The corporations, Coca-Cola, Apple, the car manufacturers, they are all desperate for this Canadian hydro-aluminum because it allows them to stamp sustainable on their products. It is a marketing necessity. But let us be serious. Is it truly sustainable to produce billions of disposable cans, fill them with sugar water that drives a public health crisis, ship them thousands of miles, and then recycle only a fraction of them? This is what I call green capitalism. It is the illusion that we can maintain the exact same patterns of infinite consumption and profit accumulation, but just do it with a slightly cleaner power source. The trade war exposes this lie. The U.S. is fighting to protect its dirty, coal-fired aluminum industry while claiming to lead the world on climate change. Canada is using its green infrastructure as a geopolitical weapon. Neither side is actually talking about reducing consumption or planning production based on human need. They are fighting over who gets to control the profits of the green transition. It is a struggle between sections of capital: fossil fuel capital versus green capital, American industrial capital versus Canadian resource capital, and the planet does not care about tariffs. The planet cares about physics, and the physics of capitalism, eternal growth on a finite sphere, is the ultimate contradiction that no trade deal can solve. So, where does this end? The United States is currently learning a hard lesson in the limits of imperial power. For 70 years, the U.S. could dictate terms. It was the hegemon, but that era is over. We are moving into a multipolar world. Canada, usually the quiet, polite neighbor, has just demonstrated that it has leverage. It has a strategic asset, energy, that the U.S. neglected. This is a sign of U.S. decline. When you cannot even bully your closest neighbor and ally because they hold the keys to your industrial supply chain, you are no longer the undisputed master of the universe. The math is ugly for the corporations, as the report said, but the math has been ugly for the working class for 40 years. The solution is not better tariffs. It is not smarter trade wars. The solution is a fundamental change in how we organize production. Imagine if the workers in the US aluminum sector and the workers in the Canadian aluminum sector got together. Imagine if they said, "We are not going to let our bosses play us off against each other. We are going to demand a North American industrial plan that guarantees jobs, guarantees green production, and distributes the wealth to the people who create it, not the shareholders." That is the nightmare of the capitalist class. They are terrified of international worker solidarity. They want you focused on the flag, not the paycheck. They want you angry at Trudeau or Trump or Biden, not at the board of directors. This aluminum war is a distraction. It is a spectacle. The real war is the class war, and it is being fought every day in the workplaces, in the communities, and in the crumbling infrastructure of a system that has lost its way. We need to democratize the enterprise. If the workers at the smelting plants ran the plants, do you think they would vote to pollute their own communities with coal? No. They would invest in cleaner technology because they live there. If the workers ran the economy, would they start a trade war that drives up prices for their neighbors? No. They would coordinate production. The irrationality of this conflict, the waste, the anger, the economic damage is a direct result of the capitalist structure of the firm. Until we change that, until we bring democracy to the workplace, we will be trapped in these absurd cycles of crisis. So the next time you pick up a soda can, look at it closely. It is not just a container for a drink. It is a crystallized embodiment of global conflict. It represents the failure of US planning, the strategic leverage of Canadian state investment, the hypocrisy of corporate greenwashing, and the exploitation of the working class on both sides of the border. The aluminum wars are not just about metal. They are about the dying gasp of a neoliberal order that can no longer deliver the goods. It is time for us to build something new. It is time to move beyond the anarchy of the market and toward a rational, democratic, and socialist future. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. I hope this analysis helps you see through the headlines and understand the deeper forces at play. I am Richard D. Wolff, and this has been Economic Update.